good evening greeting to all of you. This evening, on behalf of the University Lecture Series in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, I welcome you to this evening's seminar. And this evening we're pleased to have with us Dr. James Coleman, Professor of Sociology at the University of Chicago. And this evening, as you've seen by all the signs and all the publicity and so on, Dr. Coleman is going to discuss with us and focus on the topic of social research and policy issues. Now, Dr. Coleman has been involved in a variety of different areas of sociological work in terms of community focus, in terms of mathematical sociology, and so on. But this evening, really, I'll just sort of trace briefly his background as to why he got interested in his experiences in regard to social research and policy issues. He really first got intensively involved in the social research policy issue area in 1966 when he launched a major project on equality of educational opportunities in the U.S. Now, this project was of special significance as far as the social sciences, particularly sociology, was concerned, because it was really the first piece of major social research done directly under congressional mandate and direction and so on. It was really working with Congress. And this project really came out of the congressional passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And needless to say, this particular project activity looking at the inequality or equality of educational opportunities got him interested in policy-related research. That was a little over 10 years ago when he really got started involved in this particular activity. Now tonight, we're going to have the opportunity to learn of Dr. Coleman's current thinking on social research and policy issues. And after he gets done speaking, we'll have a chance for some questions and dialogue in the seminar this evening. So, Dr. Coleman, turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here and very pleased to discuss the kinds of things that we're going to talk about tonight. I want to discuss a number of related activities that have grown up in and around government in recent years. Now, as some of the people here at Iowa State know, the federal government has engaged in these kinds of activities for a number of years, but they've really intensified them in recent years. The activities might generally go under the heading of policy research. One of the kinds of activities is called evaluation research. Another is called social experimentation. The best example, or the best known example of social experimentation, I think, is a negative income tax experiment, which took place a few years ago in New Jersey and elsewhere. But there are other experiments of a similar sort underway now. One is an experiment to determine the effect of housing allowances in upgrading the housing available to poor persons. Another is a health insurance experiment designed to learn the effect on use of medical services of variations in the size of the deductible and in the rate of coinsurance. Now, I'll term these activities taken all together as social policy research, or sometimes I'll call them merely policy research, leaving implicit the substantive area of social policy. By policy research or social policy research, I'll mean the systematic search for information that can aid social policy. Now, social scientists stand in two relations to social policy research. One is the technical execution of the research, because they are themselves the policy researchers. The second is as social and political theorists, for whom the activity of policy research constitutes a new element in macro-social structures. That is, this kind of research is really something new in society, or relatively new, something new that's necessary to incorporate in any theoretical system about society. That is, in their role as social or political theorists, social scientists must explain the emergence of policy research. They must describe the role that it plays in the functioning of modern social systems and show how it can be incorporated into political theory. Since no political theory that I'm aware of has an explicit place for policy research within it. Now, it's in this second capacity that I'd like to appear this evening. I'd like to raise some questions about the role of policy research in a political democracy, and I'd like to begin to lay out something about the form that policy research must take if it's to aid instead of harming the political system. Now, I think it's useful to start off by noting what political theories and social constitutions specify and what they fail to specify. Political theories, and constitutions as well, are largely devoted to specifying the relations of the rulers to the ruled or of the leaders to the followers. In this way, they're devoted to the task of specifying who controls the corporate action, that is, the action of the state, and what constraints are placed on those who control that action. For example, intrinsic to democratic political theory is the idea of a deliberative body, a body such as a legislature, who are representatives of the citizens or members. Democratic political theory, as well as actual constitution, specifies in detail the structure of control over each kind of corporate action. In all organizational constitutions, similar problems are addressed. Even the charter of a business corporation specifies the kinds of actions that the chief executive officer can take on his own, the kinds that require authorization from the board of directors, and the control that the stockholders have over the board of directors. However, although political theory and constitutions are extremely attentive to problems and questions of control, they pay very little attention to questions involving information. That is, how legislative bodies obtain information to guide policy, or how voters obtain information about office holders and their challengers, how information comes to shape the very way in which policy questions are framed, or how the resolution of conflicting interests is affected by the available information. There are important exceptions to the absence of attention in constitutions and in political theories. That is, the absence of attention to information in these theories. In particular, both theories of political pluralism and constitutions of political democracies are explicitly concerned with freedom of speech, and the importance of a free press to political democracy has often been reiterated. In this sense, there's no absence of attention to information, but this is attention to information in a negative sense. It's a guarantee that there be no restriction on the right of free speech and the right to be heard. A guarantee of this sort is important, but the guarantee is not all that's necessary. It's important as exemplified by countries in which the guarantee doesn't exist. For example, I recently spoke to a Polish social scientist who was visiting the University of Chicago, and he remarked when he saw the numerous copying machines in the University of Chicago library that in his country the barrier to the use of Xerox machines was not economic but political. He went on to say that the operator of a copying machine recently refused to make him a copy of his own paper because he did not have the proper written authorization to have a copy of the paper. Now, prohibitions like this exist even in Poland, whose government is really only a pale reflection of that in the Soviet Union. But if this passive right or freedom of speech were sufficient to inform policies in a large society, there wouldn't be any necessity in the United States for the multitude of evaluations, the social experiments, the policy research which has been spawned as the federal government has begun to initiate social policy. The demands for this policy research have arisen from legislators and executives who must make policy decisions, but are far enough removed from the ultimate effects of these decisions not to be able to observe their consequences directly. It is, of course, not only in a massive nation state that such distance of policymakers from policy consequences exists. In any corporate body beyond a small organization whose members are in frequent contact, those who take corporate actions, such as the executive officer of a country, cannot directly observe the consequences of their actions. But as the size of the corporate body increases, the problem of information about policy consequences increases as well. This fact suggests one reason that constitutions are negligent of information problems, and that is that constitutions are constructed when a corporate body is born, and at that point the body is ordinarily small, so that there's relative ease of communication within it. It's later, as the corporate body becomes a large one, that the problems arise. Indeed, the right of free speech addresses itself to somewhat different problems than does the provision of policy-relevant information. For us to see that, it's only necessary to note that corporate bodies which make no pretense of political democracy and have no rights of free speech for their members nevertheless find it useful, and in some cases necessary, to institute policy research in order to increase the effectiveness of their policy. One example is large business firms, which sometimes administer employee morale surveys or carry out other research to aid in the design of policy. Another example is the socialist governments of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, which sometimes make similar use of especially commissioned polls and surveys which allow them to anticipate potential political problems. Now, both of these types of organizations really make no pretense of political democracy, neither large business firms nor socialist governments of Eastern Europe. These two examples indicate that there are really two separable information problems in large corporate bodies. One is a problem that exists only in political democracies, the problem of ensuring that each citizen and each group of citizens has the effective right to express opposition to the government or its policies. That is, the right to make its interests heard. The second is a problem that exists for any large corporate body, whatever the distribution of rights within it, to have sufficiently accurate feedback from policy actions so that those who do have political power, however broadly or narrowly that power is distributed, can efficiently achieve their policy goals. It's only in a political democracy that these problems become intertwined, because since the constitutional distribution of power is intended to be to the citizens, the provision of accurate feedback from policy actions must be not merely to a central decision maker, but also to inform all those citizens who have an interest in, that is, who are affected by a given policy. Now that, as I see it, is the crux of the matter. In a political democracy, feedback from policy is necessary, just as it is in a totalitarian regime. But that feedback must provide information relevant not only to the goals and interests of the central political authority, but also to the goals and interests of all interested parties. Yet policy research, as it's now initiated and conducted in political democracies, is not structured in a way that it can achieve this. Nor has the very conception of pluralistic policy research been enunciated in any clear fashion, so that the structures appropriate to the achievement of this conception of pluralistic policy research might be realized. The role of policy research in informing corporate actions can perhaps be illuminated by examining the role of lobbying, or more broadly, what might be termed interest representation in a democratic government. Lobbyists represent parties interested in potential legislation or administrative actions, and their aim is to obtain legislation or administrative action that has favorable consequences for the interests that they represent. A major way that they do this is by informing legislators and administrators of the anticipated consequences of the legislation for their constituencies. Their actions often include more, of which are the most often publicized things about lobbyists, such as various inducements to a legislator to act favorably to those interests. But many times I think the major role of the lobbyist is an information role. And sometimes legislators or administrators seek out lobbyists. That is, they try to search out lobbyists to find out what the potential impact of proposed legislation or agency action is on an interested party. For example, regulatory agencies, as well as congressional committees, hold extensive hearings to which affected interests are invited to testify in detail about the consequences of possible government actions for the interests they represent. Even when interest representatives bring no benefits or inducements to decision makers of the sort that are publicized about lobbyists, they are really necessary elements in the political system, because legislators or administrators have no other way of knowing how the actions they may take will affect various interested parties. In legislative actions, representation is geographic. Interests affected by legislation cut across geographic lines and are organized non-geographically. Lobbyists represent affected interests. Legislators represent geographic constituencies. And a major role of the lobbyist is to translate the effects of legislation on the interests he represents, that is the non-geographic interest he represents, into effects on the constituency the legislator represents, or in the case of an administrative agency, on the society as a whole. Lobbyists for large interests are often supported by research staffs who aid in that translation by calculating the effects, which may be indirect, first upon the interest group itself, and then on the constituencies of legislators or on the society as a whole. Now, if this process were perfect, and this may be heresy to say so, but if this process were perfect, that is, if all interests were represented by lobbyists, and if all lobbyists were able to assess accurately the consequences of legislative or administrative policies for the interests they represent, then policy research, as I see it, would be unnecessary. This would not, of course, halt the use of illegitimate inducements that are applied by various lobbyists, which result in an incorrect distribution of pressures on the legislator or on the administrator, but it would mean that full information about the policy consequences was in the hands of the legislator or the administrator. Now, there's a major difference between the social policies that the federal government has begun to carry out in recent years and the economic policies to which its actions had been largely confined before that. The social policies characteristic of the 1960s and 1970s involved direct delivery of services to individual citizens by the federal government, such as housing allowances, health insurance, the creation of community mental health centers, educational programs like Head Start, welfare programs, and a whole variety of other things of the same sort. In other cases, the policies, although they don't involve a direct delivery of services, do have a direct impact on services or goods provided to individuals. Policies such as those affecting school desegregation or school financing are examples of this. Now, for two reasons, this new set of policies creates a need for a new form of information feedback to policy. First, individual recipients of government-provided services are seldom organized so that their interests can be represented. Second, even if there were such organization, the consequences of a given policy are difficult to ascertain. The effects of Head Start or of a housing allowance program or health clinics are not directly evident and may be very different for different parties. The introduction of an education voucher or an entitlement program, for example, that would allow a family to choose its child's school from among the public or private schools in the area, is of interest to many parties. It's of interest to children, to parents, to teachers, to principals, to Catholics, to private schools, to civil rights groups, and to others. And it's of interest to them, to some of these in opposing directions. Both because individual recipients of government services are not organized and because the consequences of policies are not easily apparent, something like the social policy research that has begun to grow up is necessary. Now, if this were all there were to be said, if the policy research has grown up to fit perfectly an unfilled political niche, then we could simply sit back and marvel at the evolutionary processes in society that bring into existence appropriate political institutions. But I don't think it's this way at all. Policy research, as it's grown up, is not ideally suited to the niche it's come to fill. In fact, in its current configuration, I think it introduces systematic biases into the political system precisely because policy research has not been conceived to be an integral part of the political process, but as something outside that process. One way to see this is to note that policy research in political democracies has as its predecessor market research and things related to market research, test marketing, audience research, and new product testing. Not only the research methods have been taken over, but the structures within which policy research is originated and carried out have been adopted as well. In market research and its relatives, the research problem is originated by the central management of the organization or by a research department which has the responsibility of initiating research that can provide information that's of benefit to central management. There's no conception that research problems may be initiated by the customers to provide information that can be of benefit to the customers. For example, a manufacturer's research department does not design research on comparative product testing let's say of automobiles, to discover for customers the qualities and defects of each brand in a market. If it does carry out comparative product testing, it keeps the results hidden from its competitors and customers. Now, I think it should not do otherwise, because a customer has, as I see it, no legitimate voice in the manufacturer's policy decisions, except as he exercises that voice in the market. I think, however, that the same cannot be said for policy research and government policy. For the citizens who are affected by the policy also have a legitimate voice in that policy. Thus, it's appropriate for citizens confronted by a proposed policy to have control over portions of the research that's initiated to reform that policy. For example, it is citizens who, through taxes, pay for their schools. They have a legitimate interest in having information on their school's performance collected and published to aid them in deciding how to respond to proposed school tax increases or school bond issues. And there are research departments in most large school systems which could provide information relevant to those decisions for the clients of the schools. But the research departments do not do this. They obtain data to aid the school administration in their decisions. Even this information, although nominally open to the public, has been held very closely. Only in recent years, for example, have citizens groups been able to force publication of school average test scores on standardized tests. Now, in nearly every case where information relevant to making decisions is obtained, the design, execution, and publication of the research attend solely to the information needs of the central policymakers, and not to the interests of affected parties, nor to the interests of those citizens with ultimate authority over or responsibility for those policies. To be sure, the policymaker or the legislator may aim to satisfy interests of constituents in order to stay in office, just as a manufacturer may aim to satisfy customers' interests in order to stay in business. But unless the various interested parties are able to exercise some voice in the design and publication of the research, then even if the policymaker is motivated in this way, he cannot be sure that information attentive to those interests is obtained. Now, an example which shows this with some additional complications occurred in policy research which was carried out on a set of things that were called planned variations for something that was called follow-through. The reason it was called follow-through is it followed Head Start programs. These planned variations were special programs of instruction initiated and funded by the U.S. Office of Education and acquiesced in by the number of local school systems. The idea was that evaluative research on the effects of these programs would be carried out. It would be carried out comparatively, and then the local systems themselves would pick up the programs that were most successful. Now, where did the mistake lie? The mistake lay in the design of the research. Because the Office of Education felt that achievement in reading and arithmetic were the most important consequences of the programs, and many of us may feel the same way, that's what they wanted out of them. The research was designed primarily to examine those achievement consequences. But as I learned when I heard an assistant superintendent from Philadelphia, which was one of the school systems that was involved in the follow-through programs, describe his reaction to the research that was carried out on follow-through, the consequences that were most important to the local school systems were neglected. In many cases, they weren't even measured. For example, how acceptable the program was to the teachers, how much it would add to per pupil cost, how it affected absenteeism of students, what was its holding power in keeping middle-class families from leaving the city and in keeping lower-class children from leaving the school. Consequently, although the research was initiated at the federal level, the final policy decisions would have to be made at the local level, and the research as designed was largely irrelevant to those decisions. As a consequence, the programs were not picked up at the local level. Now, before attempting to answer the question of how publicly funded research should be carried out, I'd like to turn to another example. Exactly the same kinds of questions I'm asking arise in non-social science areas as well. The role of systematic information is just as important in some of these other areas, although we think that some areas of physical science are more developed than in social science, exactly the same kind of problems arise. For example, the Environmental Protection Agency establishes automobile emission standards and related regulations based on the effects of various pollutants from emissions, that is, from automobile emissions, on health. But there's great uncertainty about the facts of the matter. Sometimes the uncertainty concerns the effects of the pollutants on health, and other times the uncertainty concerns the effect of the automobile emissions on pollutants in the ambient air. So there are really two links to the chain. Now, as one example, EPA analyses showed that oxides of nitrogen were quite harmful to health. But later reanalyses showed that some of the calculations were in error. It wasn't just that the research was maybe not very well conceived, but actual errors in calculations. Now, it's clear what the effect, or fairly clear, what the effect of a given emission level of oxides of nitrogen is on the oxides of nitrogen in ambient air, that is on the pollutants. But what's not at all clear is just what the effects of given ambient levels of oxides of nitrogen are on health. Yet NOx standards, that is, standards on oxides of nitrogen, which affect possibly the health of Americans, and they affect definitely the pocketbooks of automobile purchasers and the jobs of automobile workers and the economic success of various automobile companies, have been set and will continue to be set in the future. Now, the question is, under whose control should the publicly financed research on oxides of nitrogen be carried out? Should it be carried out under EPA's control? EPA represents not all these interests, but only the health interests. And those health interests lead to very low levels of oxides of nitrogen, maybe lower than is appropriate. And in fact, it was EPA's calculation errors which made those, which effectively lowered those levels. If reanalyses of EPA's calculations on oxides of nitrogen by other interested parties hadn't been carried out, an error which has subsequently been admitted would have been perpetuated. Now, should it be under the automobile company's control? Their interests, of course, lead in keeping admissible levels of oxides of nitrogen very high, so that they can, so that will prevent the increased costs of developing alternative engines, which lead to fewer car sales. And to put the research under control of auto manufacturers would be really a folly. It would be to provide a special interest with public funds to pursue their special interests. And the automakers can allocate some of their own funds to this purpose, although less than is available through the federal budget. But if neither of these interests is to control the public funds, then who is to control them? Now, I'll give another example in the same area. There's a controversy over sulfur dioxide from automobile emissions with catalytic converters. Here, there's no question about the health effect of sulfur dioxide because that is bad. That is, it combines with oxygen to produce sulfate ion, and then with water vapor to produce sulfuric acid, and sulfuric acid is not good on the lungs. What is not clear is the effect of emissions from automobiles with catalytic converters on ambient air quality, since there is a lot of SO2 in the air from, not a lot, but the levels of SO2 in the air from industrial and other sources are high relative to that from automobile emissions. And SO2 disperses and rises fairly quickly. Again, EPA carried out calculations showing that under certain unfavorable conditions, SO2 levels at roadside of a wide expressway with catalyst-equipped traffic would experience a health hazard. General Motors disputed these calculations and designed experiments in which SO2 levels were measured under unfavorable traffic and weather conditions that were under discussion. Now, GM made a proposal to let the experiment be jointly designed and executed by auto manufacturers and EPA, although GM would pay for it. Now, EPA refused that, but later they did participate in the experiment to the extent of carrying out their own measurement at the experimental site. Now, the question is this: how should the research have been organized? How should it have been controlled, and how should it have been paid for? Should the research have been, as proposed, jointly controlled and designed, that is, jointly controlled by EPA and the auto companies? Who should have paid for the research? In this case, GM was large enough to do so, but in many cases, interested parties aren't sufficiently well organized nor sufficiently affluent to do this. Now, one might suggest that in a case like this, the appropriate information generating structure is one which the federal agency that is responsible for generating the information combines in itself the relevant interests, and then the agency controls the research with inputs from each of the relevant interests. Clearly, the EPA isn't that kind of agency, for its mission is to ensure that the interests of the population in pleasant, non-irritating, and non-toxic environmental conditions are met. It is subject to constraints imposed by other interests, such as the interest of that same population in economic prosperity and inexpensive consumer goods and energy conservation, but these are clearly constraints and they're not part of EPA's mission. A beginning in the appropriate direction would be an agency concerned simultaneously with environmental and energy considerations. But a much more full-scale realization of this would be an agency in which there was a representation of health interests, perhaps from the Surgeon General's office or from NIH, of auto workers' interests from the UAW, of automobile companies' interests, of auto consumers' interests, and conservationists' interests. Such an agency would be a kind of council of interested parties, which directed the goals and general design of publicly supported research on automobile emission regulations. The problem of representation of diverse interests in decision-making is already fully recognized in pluralist political theory. That is, representation in decision-making. And whether or not the appropriate representation in decision-making exists now for various regulatory problems, the principles of this are clear. What's not clear is the appropriate structure, not for decision-making, but for generating the information relevant to those policy decisions. But before coming to a premature resolution of the matter, I'd like to turn to another example of policy and policy-related information, this time in social science. The example is school desegregation, a case in which I've carried out research relevant to the interests of parties on both sides of the conflict. From the 1954 Supreme Court decision forbidding legally segregated school systems, information from social science research has played a central role. The decision itself, that evidence was provided by the NAACP representing a single set of interests. Thus, at the very beginning, social science research results were provided from the perspective of one set of interests and not from others. Now, we may feel that the outcome was just, and thus that it was appropriate that social science information from the perspective of only a single interest was presented and used. But the justice of the decision is independent of the research results, so that our response should be, I think, to be correct, that no research results were relevant to this decision and that the decision should have stood on constitutional grounds alone. Now, the second major genesis and use of social science research results was initiated by the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which directed the Commissioner of Education to carry out a survey which was designed to be a survey of the lack of equal educational opportunity by race and other attributes. This survey, again, was directed to examining educational institutions from the point of view of a single interest, that is, the interest of minorities which that act was attempting to protect and aid. This is, of course, as it should be, since that act itself was designed to further those interests. That is, it was a Civil Rights Act to protect those interests. And in the design of the research, leaders of various interest groups devoted to civil rights of minorities were consulted. Now, the results of the research published in 1966 did not provide exactly the kind of information that was anticipated, but nevertheless, the report was focused on questions that were relevant to a particular interest, that is, how minorities' educational chances are affected by current educational practices, and much less on other questions of interest to other parties. For example, how middle-class children's performance was affected by high proportions of lower-class children in their classrooms. As a consequence, it provided information principally relevant to those interests for which it was designed. I'm not suggesting that the answers were biased given the questions, but rather the questions were narrower than they would have been if the study's origins had a broader interest base. The report came to be used very widely to support plans for affirmative integration at the level of school boards, HEW proposed plans, and court decisions. It is significant that parties which presently oppose those actions and current actions of affirmative integration in the schools often point to that research as a central factor in bringing about those policies. Whether or not that's so, that is, whether or not the research was a central factor, it was widely used by parties pushing for affirmative integration. Now, the next body of research-generated information relating to school desegregation was that was initiated by local school systems undergoing school desegregation. This research, for the first time, had a broader interest base. For although it was ordinarily carried out by a division of the school system that was also engaged in implementing school desegregation in the district, and that's a structure which is shown to be conducive to positive results, the district was interested in knowing whether desegregation was successful and what continuing support it might have from all of the segments of the community. For this reason, a new interest was represented in the research. That is, the interest of the local school system which was engaged in implementing school desegregation. Now, it's significant that these new interests were not broader than those in the earlier stages, nor were they in necessary conflict with them, but they were different. Thus, in a few instances, because of the differing interests, the school districts initiated research on white flight, or loss of whites from the system due to desegregation. That is research that would never have been initiated by civil rights interests themselves. But in at least one such case, and I suspect in others, the interests of the district administration in maintaining stability and order in the system succeeded in suppressing the results of the study so that they were never made public. Now, this research, although still having a greater component of certain special interests, as I've described, does begin to provide a broader base of interest sponsorship than had previously been true for school desegregation. Thus, the research results begin to provide a somewhat broader information base for policy decisions about affirmative integration in the schools. There's also a natural interest among researchers in proving another researcher wrong, or at least in making incisive criticism of other people's research, so that this aids in providing some tendency toward a diversity of orientations which might arrive at different results. There is, however, an opposing tendency in certain areas where social scientist values are uniform, and that's a tendency which suppresses the diversity of orientations that would otherwise arise from scholarly competition. Now, one might then ask whether there's a lacuna, a gap in research which might pose questions and pursue them from the perspective of other interests. That is, interests which, for one reason or another, oppose the policy of compulsory racial balance, which has emerged in recent years as the principal method of school desegregation in large cities. I discovered a year and a half ago, more or less by accident, that there was such a gap when I reported as a subsidiary segment of a paper dealing with trends in segregation that school desegregation in large cities was causing significant degrees of white flight from those cities, accelerating a trend that was producing black cities and white suburbs. The attention that this result received and the hostility that it generated on the part of those whose interests it endangered, that is, the civil rights groups who were pressing the legal suits for compulsory racial balance in large city schools, was startling to me. And it was indicative, I think, of the research vacuum that had existed until that time. Although there had been a few studies of the effects of desegregation on white flight with mixed conclusions, there were a number of large cities in which the simplest statistical examination over time would have shown strikingly the white flight generated by desegregation in that city. This flight was obvious in a qualitative way to local observers, and the threat of white flight was even used by advocates of racial balance when they pressed for metropolitan-wide desegregation, as in Detroit or in Louisville. But the interests that were responsible for the flight itself, that is, the interests of parents, mostly white, who felt their children's education harmed by the policy, were so unorganized and so distant from the research process and so distant from research funds that the obvious, simple, and straightforward research that could have been done was not done. The distance of those interests from research and funds was partly due to the fact that any interests opposing school racial balance were tainted by association with racism and prejudice, an association that remains and that inhibits those who have other, more legitimate interests opposing the policy from acting in any organized way, and leaving open to them only a quiet individual exit from a desegregated school system. Nor were the other interests that were harmed by the flight, such as school district and city officials attempting to maintain an integrated city with a racially mixed population base, much more able to initiate such research, partly because of the fear of this association with racism and prejudice, and partly because they were local while the desired information should transcend a single city. Now, the failure of this research to be done, the failure of the facts about desegregation and white flight to be known, except locally and in a qualitative way, created a vacuum which, when filled, produced explosive results. The effect was that of a naive child pointing out what each had known but all had suppressed in the name of the common good. Now, all this is not to say, of course, that such research results should be determining of policy, but rather that in this area there had been a serious imbalance in the genesis and use of information from social science research by the peculiar structure through which policy-relevant research on school desegregation was produced. None of these research results should affect the elimination of de jure segregation, for such segregation violates the equal protection provision of the Constitution. But beyond that, into affirmative integration of the sort that's characteristic of recent policies, research initiated from the perspective of all legitimate interests is necessary. The research initiated from the perspective of other interests should take its place alongside the great mass of research initiated from the perspective of the interest pressing for racial balance. In particular, two kinds of research have been nearly missing because of the inappropriate structure by which research was initiated. One is the psychological effect of being in a racial minority or racial majority in school. Black parents and white parents and their children have a strong interest in this question, but the question has not been prominent in desegregation research. Two very recent research projects have begun to ask the question, and the very novelty of its being asked concerning white children was sufficient that even a small and preliminary study was recently reported in Time magazine. Now, a second kind of research in which many parties have an interest, though the structure by which desegregation research is initiated has not generated that research, is research on the conditions under which desegregation is successful in creating positive interracial attitudes among children, positive attitudes toward the school, toward teachers of both races, and positive morale of teachers. Why has this research seldom been done? I cannot answer this, but only note that it hasn't been done. Now, I think we can back away from this example as from the other examples and ask just how research might appropriately have been initiated, relevant to this variety of interests. I believe the appropriate structure is a structure analogous to that I described in the case of automobile emissions. A research initiation council on desegregation, to use this example, with explicit representation from all the legitimate interests that might be affected. Civil rights groups, black parents and white parents with children in public schools that would be extensively affected by desegregation, representatives of large city school administrations, from the teachers' unions, and from city administrations. Unlike legislatures in which policy decisions are made, which have geographic constituencies, or regulatory agencies which are intended to have no constituencies, such representation would be explicit interest representation. Now, while a body like this could hardly be expected to make equitable policy decisions because the opposition of interests is wholly between the representatives rather than partly within each one of them, it could, I think, generate the variety of research questions that would provide information relevant to all the affected parties. In other words, it's not appropriate for making decisions, but it is appropriate, I think, for generating research questions. The correct location for such a council would be in the National Institute of Education, and I think we could find comparably appropriate locations for research-generating councils on other issues that exist in other agencies of the federal government. Now, there is currently a desegregation unit in the National Institute of Education, which could function in that way, but the research on desegregation or on any other topic in NIE is not generated in this way. It's either generated by the NIE staff, who then circulate requests for proposals among research organizations, or by the interest in both senses of the word of researchers who themselves submit unsolicited proposals for funding. NIH has similar procedures as do other agencies that fund policy research. The question I'm raising here in its narrowest sense is whether these are appropriate structures for generating information relevant to social policy in political democracy. There have developed, of course, structures of a variety of types that have representation of interest, either explicit or implicit. Most of these in the federal government or in state governments are in the form of advisory committees established by agencies in the executive branch. In the 1974 Index of Federal Advisory Committees, AT&T has 95 representatives on various committees. IT&T has 86. Large corporations in general have extensive representation. Whether the advisory committees contain representation of other, less well-organized interests related to the committee's business is less clear. In any case, the issue at hand concerns councils designed to generate policy-relevant information, and so these advisory committees that I've described are only tangentially relevant to that. However, more detailed knowledge of how these advisory committees in government function would aid the design, I think, of appropriate councils of the sort that I've described, although most of the advisory committees have functions that are different from those that I've discussed. Now, I'd like to finally return to an examination of these matters from a somewhat broader view. To do that, I'd like to go back to the general point I raised near the beginning of the presentation. I argued that in a political democracy governing a large social system, constitutions and political theory have much to say concerning the structure by which decisions are made, for these problems existed even when the society was small. But neither constitutions nor political theory are attentive to the structure by which information is generated that forms a partial basis for these decisions. The examples I've cited show that such information can be very important to the policy outcomes, and I've made some suggestions about structures that would be appropriate for generating that information. These suggestions are, of course, not at all definitive, but I hope they help initiate the kind of discourse which will lead to structures more appropriate than those which currently exist. Thank you very much. Now, I'll be very glad to discuss these matters further. For those of you who would like to stay and raise some questions, we might have a few minutes of kind of discussion on these issues. Well, the question is, if we have these kinds of councils in which there are various conflicting interests which generate policy relevant information, then let's suppose information is then generated, then it'll be, as you say, a mixed bag of good news and bad news from any policy that might be generated, and won't that be really just like testimony for the plaintiff and defendant, expert testimony? I think there certainly would be some of that, but the fact that expert testimony for the plaintiff and defendant doesn't always work well, and sometimes doesn't illuminate the scene very fully, is no reason why it's abandoned. That is, it is used because sometimes it does illuminate the scene more fully. In other words, that the expert testimony or the policy research information should not be determining. All it should do is provide the particular interests who do have a voice in these decisions with information relevant to their interests. Let me give another kind of example, again in education. Almost no research has been done on absenteeism in schools. Yet I've received letters from teachers who have asked over and over again, why isn't research done on absenteeism in schools? Now, if teachers had some kind of voice in research which was carried out with regard to education, there would probably be some useful research generated on absenteeism in schools. In other words, I'm saying that there is a kind of narrowness that occurs in the way in which, let's say specifically, educational research is now focused, which is probably not good. For example, nearly all of the research focuses on the achievement consequences, ordinarily in mathematics and reading, of particular policies. Now, that research has oftentimes also given a mixed bag of good news and bad news, more bad news than good news. So that hasn't led to any, in general, hasn't led to any innovative and promising policies either. I think that the research that should have been generated should have included that kind of research, but it should have included some of these other kinds of things as well. And the question is, what is a proper structure to ensure that some of these other kinds of things, such as absenteeism, such as teachers' morale, such as psychological state of well-being of a child, are addressed? And that's really the question that I'm raising. What kind of structure will ensure that those kinds of problems are addressed?
running headlong against the problem in which an interest group might very well contract for positive findings from a researcher with the attendant problem of slanting and maybe unintentionally biasing the research into themselves.
To repeat briefly, the question is, doesn't this kind of thing lend itself to really biased research, since the research may be done on behalf of some kind of interested party? I think that is a serious danger. However, I think that the recognition of that danger is not sufficient to negate the kind of proposals that I've made, because now it's the case that research is generated by or to further the values of particular interests, but there's nothing to ensure that that there is any kind of balancing, not balancing in the sense of balancing of results, but that there's any kind of balanced generation of research to address other interests. So it's not the case that research is interest-free because of the fact that we don't have that kind of structure that I've been describing. It's just that the interests are not explicitly recognized. Now let me give an example of research which was generated by an interested party. A program called More Effective Schools was initiated in New York City by the New York Federation of Teachers. That was a research, a pilot program, and the pilot program had basically the following structure. It introduced 2 teachers into a classroom instead of 1. So basically it cut the teacher's load in half. Well, it operated in different ways, but all of the ways in which it operated was to cut the teacher's load in half. Now, the research that was done on that was research which ended up showing, well, the 2 pieces of research were done on that. Some research which the Federation of Teachers had commissioned by an outside agency, and then some research which they themselves had done. I think several things can be noted about this. First of all, that kind of program would not have been initiated by another interested party. Notice that the program was one which was basically reducing the teacher's workload. And why was it introduced by the New York Federation of Teachers? Well, it's not difficult to imagine. But that's not to say that such a program should not have been initiated, because of the fact that maybe maybe the New York Federation, maybe the teachers are right. Maybe, in fact, that is one of the things inhibiting achievement. So that I'm saying one can recognize that it was self-interest which generated that research or that pilot program, without saying that that pilot program should not have been generated for that reason. The second point to note about that is that the outside research which was commissioned found that there were really no gains due to more effective schools. The third was, or any kind of gains were very questionable. The third point is that the internal research disputed to some degree the external research. Not so much in terms of the facts, although there was some kind of disputation with regard to the facts, but in terms of what kind of weight were given to particular things. Now, what I'm saying with regard to the latter 2 points is that I think it's a very good thing that research was done by a party which was really part of the New York Federation of Teachers, as well as an outside group, because the dispute between them then could allow the outside observer to more clearly make up his own mind about whether there was an effect or not an effect. So that I think that there is the kind of danger that you're suggesting, but also there's the benefit of bringing out into the open kinds of interests and conflicts of interest that don't happen, I think, otherwise.
In your report's desegregation research council, I'm not clear on 3 points. 1, who does the research? 2, who pays for the research? And 3, who is the audience for the research? Is there a predetermined audience for that research? Policymakers, legislators,
Well, with regard to the question is who, the question is in a desegregation council or research generated by a desegregation council, who does the research, who pays for it, and who's the audience for it. Well, I think that the existence of a National Institute of Education helps answer that question, because now the people who do the research are professional research investigators, whether at universities or other organizations, other research organizations. I would not suggest that that research be done any differently than it is now. My research has to do with how the requests for proposals get initiated, basically, so that it's that which, and certainly the request for proposals could not spring full-blown out of the discussions of such a council. They would require some kind of professional expertise as well. But what I'm the point that I'm arguing is that the present procedure for generating requests for proposals is not the right procedure. The second is who pays for such research. I think in this case, in the case of school desegregation and in cases involving education in general, I don't see a problem with regard to that. I think it should be paid for by public funds. That is, that all of these interests are relevant to the issue of school desegregation. All of these interests are legitimate parts of the public, and insofar as it's not a constitutional issue, which should be dealt with by the courts anyway, then I think it should be paid for by public funds. The third question, who is the audience, is, I think, a much more complex question because of the fact that educational policy in the United States is not set by a single party. It's set in a very decentralized and disorganized way. And so the audience, I think, would be a very multifarious audience. It would be an audience which consisted of everything from local school boards and local school superintendents to federal agencies and to Congress. So that in a decision area which is as oddly organized or disorganized or decentralized as education in the United States, the question of audience is one, I think, such that the research simply has to be cast out on the waters like bread and then interested parties who have inputs into policy decisions use that. I'm not sure about how research should be disseminated in that case, but I do think that it's a very different situation than when the audience is basically a single party, like Congress, for example, making a decision about housing allowances, which is somewhat different. That is a decision as to whether to continue public housing construction or to use housing allowances instead.
Curious how you would select the members, by what criteria or what structure the membership?
The question is, how could one select members for such councils? I don't know, and it may be that the very notion of such a council is not the right kind of notion. It may be that the more appropriate structure would be one in which the professionals that the mandate given to the professionals was to take specific interests into account and therefore to consult with particular interested parties in the design of RFPs and to leave to the professionals the consultation with the interested parties. In other cases, so that may be a preferable way. I argued very strongly for these kinds of research councils. On the other hand, I haven't any kind of firm conclusions in this regard. The point that you raise, I think, points to a serious weakness of any kind of council of that sort, because the question of whether a research question gets initiated depends upon the quality of a particular representative and a variety of things like that, so that there are very weak, serious weak points to that proposal, and there might be alternative proposals which would be superior to that. Perhaps some kind of proposals a little bit like, almost a little bit like a survey, which went to particular interested parties and which came back and was examined to determine really what are the particular kinds of questions that are generated by being in a given interest position. So that the answer is I'm not sure.
Is it likely that a researcher working with a council like this might receive less challenge in terms of a research design, including sample selection and measurement techniques, than when working in another kind of arrangement? And if that were to be the case, would there likely be errors like as occurred in the example you gave of EPA's study?
Well, if I understand the question correctly, the question is, would there be less challenge to a researcher who is commissioned to carry out research which is explicitly addressed to the interests of a particular interested party, and might not that generate errors in the research results? I don't know that it would, because the fact that a problem is generated by an interested party, take the question of absenteeism in schools. The fact that that's generated by the interests of teachers who want to have those bodies around so that they can teach them, or who are concerned about the kind of disorganization that's introduced into the school by not knowing who's going to be present on a given day. The fact that that's generated by their interests doesn't mean that it's any less challenging a task to the researcher, I don't think.
Maybe my question wasn't clear. I was thinking of a researcher who's related to a council, that is, that represents a broad spectrum of interests, where if that were to be the case, perhaps less people might challenge it because of the fact that the researcher says, I have now visited with all of these parties, and I have all of the relevant interests in mind, and therefore
Errors. I think so if it were done that way, but I'm thinking about multiple research projects, with each project being addressed not to the whole range of interests, but to some subset of those interests. For example, there was a study of Sesame Street and the effects of Sesame Street. That study was carried out by Educational Testing Service under a grant from Children's Television Workshop. Now, subsequently, there was another study, a reevaluation of Sesame Street, by another researcher who didn't dispute the facts of the first evaluation, but who did it from a much more distant perspective. That is, he was not paid by Children's Television Workshop. He was not kind of near to them in any way. He was paid by Russell Sage Foundation, and his interests, in fact, were more nearly to discover errors in their research. I think it would have been better if both of those research projects had been initiated from the very beginning. What he found were things really quite different from what, or his conclusions were really quite different from theirs. So that I think that built into the structure of evaluation ought to be this recognition of conflict of interest, and I agree with you that it should not be within a given research project, but it should be to some degree between research projects. Not wholly so, because then research becomes indistinguishable from advocacy. And so there's a delicate balance that has to be achieved, but somehow the first point, I think, is a recognition that the model of disinterested research, which we're used to from the discipline, is not the model that we ought to follow in this case, because all research in these cases is relevant to particular interests, and by following the model of disinterested research, I think we blind ourselves to the particular interests that the research favors or doesn't favor. So that it's not the question of disinterested research so much as multiple interests in relation to research on given areas. So we probably should have only maybe 2 more questions.
I'd like to follow directly up on that. If what is called for is disinterested research, what implications or consequences do you see of maybe rethinking the sort of standard orthodox things like contract methodology, big M methodology? Do you feel there's a message here to make this brought up, or we couldn't have
The question is, incidentally, the reason I'm repeating these questions is not just to make sure that I get them right, but rather because the radio station can't get the questions from there, and they want to know, they want to have me repeat them. So the question is, but it does also help make sure that I understand what the question is. Would this kind of change from disinterested research to interested or interested research, which does recognize values, although values need not, should not, as I have not emphasized, but as I would certainly hold, values should not play a part in the execution of the research, only in the problem definition. Does this have implications for our methodology? I think it does have implications, and I don't know exactly what those implications are. I've tried to explore a little bit some of those implications in terms of the implications for research methods, but I've not more than scratched the surface with regard to this. But I think you're exactly right in the kind of suggestion of your question that it does have, I think, some fairly strong implications for the kinds of research methodology that we carry out. Okay, I think this should probably be the last question.
In a particular issue, when you have a number of interested parties reaching conflicting resolves, do you think courts or legislature should step in and mandate regulations or conduct their own research and to either confirm or disconfirm what the groups agree?
So the question is, if there is a situation in which there are conflicting results from different research, then should legislatures or courts or whatever is a decision-making body step in and mandate their own research? I think sometimes that's necessary, but I think sometimes the very the very explication of the research results and the very discussion between the two conflicting research results leads to an understanding of the source of those results, which allows the observer who's trying to find out really what is the situation to see more clearly than he could have seen from either one. So many times I think the additional research is not necessary. I think that the very contraposition of these two pieces of research will oftentimes be sufficiently illuminating that then one can say this is a particular policy that should be pursued. To take for example, the Sesame Street research. The first researchers for Children's Television Workshop, who were at ETS, found that when children watched television, when children watched Sesame Street, then independent of their socioeconomic background, they learned equally much. That is, children of low socioeconomic background learned as much as children from high socioeconomic background. Now that was quite a striking finding because one of the things that's characteristic of most educational techniques is that whatever kind of technique it is, the children from higher socioeconomic background learn more than those from lower socioeconomic background. So that this was really quite striking result. Now the subsequent researcher who was not who was paid for by Russell Sage Foundation to carry out a secondary evaluation, his results agreed with those. But he showed something in addition that the first researchers did not show, and that is that children from lower socioeconomic levels tended to watch less often than children from higher socioeconomic levels. So that, in fact, one could calculate that Sesame Street probably had an effect in increasing the gap, even though it raised the average for both lower socioeconomic levels and high socioeconomic levels. Now, there was also evidence that showed that, although the samples were not very large, that lower socioeconomic level blacks watch more than lower socioeconomic level whites, so that this result did not hold for widening the gap, say, between whites and blacks, but only for between socioeconomic levels, let's say, of whites. So that there's no real argument then between them in terms of what the results are. We learn more from reading both of them than we would from either one of them. We can make our own judgment if we're called upon to say whether Sesame Street should receive more funding or not, which is different from the judgment that the secondary evaluator would have made. In my case, it's different from his judgment. He says, well, Sesame Street should not be funded until it reduces the gap, should not be further funded until it reduces the gap. And my evaluation would not be the same as that. But nevertheless, I know more than I would have known if only the ETS research had been done. So that this leads me to perhaps push, if I were a policymaker, push Sesame Street toward greater attention, not to lower socioeconomic children learning more from Sesame Street, but to modifying it in one way or another, modifying something so that they watched it more. You see what I'm saying? Okay, I've talked too much. Thank you very much. Thank you.